Hello everyone and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 12 years now, and I sit within the knowledge and practice area of the organisation, looking at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, finance, valuation, brokerage, building operation, asset management, and indeed end of life, obviously there are huge areas where data and technology is having a very profound and valuable effect. And indeed, our members work across all the major asset types: land itself, residential, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure. So a hugely broad canvas upon which data and technology is having a profound impact on the profession and the people who use real estate. And I'm really glad to have Dan join me today from Reasult to talk about what they're doing. So Dan, please do join me on the call.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Pleasure. Morning, Dan. And before we get into the bits and bytes and more detail about what Reasult does, it'd be great to have a bit about your backstory and the origin story of Reasult.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, my name is Dan. I'm working as a product manager for Reasult. Reasult is a software company founded 22 years ago in the Netherlands. And we are recently part of the Planon Group, which is a global software company, mainly known for software facility management. So Reasult is offering purely software for the real estate market, not only real estate investors, but also real estate developers. And we are currently developing a brand new real estate management solution for managing your standing portfolio, but also doing acquisition scenarios, budgeting, and valuation. And that last part is why we are here today.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And what particularly made Reasult look at becoming a tech partner and working with RICS?
Yeah, so mainly we have a lot of clients that use the RICS global standard as a standard for the valuations. So of course we have to comply with that standard. We do not only offer a calculation engine to calculate the market value, but we also are a report generator. So we create the report, the actual valuation reports, and of course the RICS global standard gives you practices about what should contain in this report. And finally, I mentioned previously that we are developing this new real estate management platform, which is for the European market. And you have these international standards like RICS, but also, of course, the international valuation standard and the European valuation standards. But they only tell you about what should contain, what should be in the valuation report, and also about the rules, let's say, of the valuation, but not the local practices. And what we found within the RICS is that you have a best practice for each country, and you not only see the regulations that there are in each country, but also the best practices that the evaluator use in those countries. So we looked at all those countries and define a line to see how can we create a generic real estate valuation platform in which all these countries can do their valuations. So yeah, that was our first big point. I think secondly is that the demand for data is growing, and we as Reasult do not try to achieve this single point solution where you can do everything. So I think the best solution for the future is to create an ecosystem in which multiple companies can work together, exchange data, and provide all the solutions that a client needs to handle these complex data questions that they have. So we also joined the RICS Tech Partner Program, of course, to start this ecosystem with other software companies or data companies or companies who are within the real estate market, to create these ecosystems that we can exchange this data that we are all creating and serve the client the best. And finally, of course, is that it's the knowledge transfer that we can discuss between the tech partners about the future of real estate, and also how data can be a large part of that future. Of course, we know all these new innovations with OpenAI and how it changes the landscape. And when you talk about it with multiple companies throughout Europe and even in America, you can maybe find some solutions or ideas to improve the landscape.
That's great to hear, Dan. And I guess it's always important, I think, for us to recognize that data and technology is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And I suppose in that sense, what are your thoughts around how software can improve the quality of valuations? Because clearly it's there to make things better. And how do you think it can help?
Exactly. So at first, I think starts with the process of evaluation. So normally, in a traditional way, you will create the terms of engagement with your evaluator, and therein define which standards to use. And then this huge mail trail starts with sending data, and mostly it's privacy. So it's like the data integrity is also a part, and you all send it through email or Dropbox, or we transfer files, and it's a large amount of data. And then the evaluator creates a concept valuation, and that is also sent through email. And then the reactions on that concept valuation by the client is also sent through email. So you get these huge email logs. And when somebody asks how the process went, you have to gather all this information. So I think within software, you can embed this process, deadlines, and create a trail of conversations between the client and the valuer about the actual valuation. So you keep it in the software, and it's therefore helping the independency of the valuer, of course, but also makes it much more understandable how you came to eventually the value of the asset. I think also, yeah, sure.
No, carry on, Dan.
Also, we have like the data governance. That's an important thing that software helps. And we have a client case in which the client said it took them a couple of weeks to start each valuation round. They have around 1,500 assets in their portfolio, and then each quarter it took them a few weeks. So that's a lot of time for a team to gather all the data. And now they created an API keys with their enterprise resource planning. You can recognize maybe as a SAP or a Yardi. These are all ERP systems. And they created API keys to transfer data to a software platform, in this case, Reasult, which handles the valuation. So there were no human interferences. The data integrity was correct. There were predefined flows, data flows. So from multiple weeks each quarter, it took them half a day. And it was mainly to solve data issues that was still in the data. So yeah, like your data governance is so much better, I think, with software instead of the traditional way.
You've highlighted that data governance piece. I mean, which other parts of the process are you looking to automate and improve, and as you say, save time, but also bring other kinds of improvements?
Yeah, of course. So it's not only saving time, but it's also that there's a single point of truth. I think that is also a thing that helps. That you know that we always have the same conversation with a client, and for example, we recognize a fact. An effect we say is maybe the square meters of an apartment. We can have a discussion about the square meters of an apartment, but if somebody measures this apartment based on a standard, and it's recognized maybe it's 1,000 square meters, I don't know how much it is in feet, but then that is the fact. It's like 100 square meters, and we can debate about it, but eventually that is the fact. So that should be the same in your whole data governance. So not only in your ERP system, but also all the systems that you use after. So for example, results for your valuations, that the same amount of square meters should be in that for the dwelling in our system compared to the ERP system. So the single source of truth principle is also really important, and that you see if you do it without software, without data trails, you see that there's always some changes happening because through Excel there's human interference. Maybe some lookup went wrong, or some mistakes were made, or some data were changed, and then you don't have this single point of truth principle anymore.
So are you trying to encourage people, dare I say it, to stop using Excel and and to recognize that actually you need, because people are very sort of wedded, aren't they, to their personal spreadsheets and their personal data silos? Are you trying to encourage a different kind of culture of using these kind of software as a service type, these other ways of having data sets?
I think Excel is a beautiful program. I use it personally, like for work a lot, but it has its limitations. And the thing is with Excel is that there's no authorization in Excel. Everybody can change the Excel. Maybe you have it locked by somebody with a password, but it's difficult to see who changed what. And we also say Excel is always a square box with a number in it. So you have this cell, which is a square box with a number in it. If you do, I think Excel is really good, but if you transfer the Excel behavior to a software platform, so that's what we did. We use a component called AG-Grid, which it looks exactly like Excel. So you have a grid, rows, and columns. That's the basic. But you can copy paste, which is really cool with Excel. You can copy from Excel to our software. But you can also see where the data is coming from. So instead of having a cell with a number, I now have exactly the same cell, but that cell shows me if the number is somewhere from a default, or maybe I'm calculating multiple strategies, variance from the same asset. Is it inherited from another strategy? Because some variables do not change between different strategies that I want to calculate variance. Maybe it's even from a different time period. So we say a valuer can maybe calculate a capex investment, and due to that capex investments, some variables change. Maybe the market rent goes up through that capex investment. So that means instead of having a market value on valuation date, I also have a market value after my capex investments. So we have even some time, when we call them assumption periods, which means that you have multiple assumptions in different periods. So we even can have cells that look at previous assumption periods and see if there's a difference. We can have cells that say it's mandatory, it must be unique, but can have in-cell data validation. So it says like you want to rent this dwelling for this amount in this contract, but know that this dwelling is already rented in another contract. So help the user to understand what he's filling in. There's also an audit log, so I know exactly who changed what in what cell. So a cell becomes so much more than the Excel cell that you have in Excel that we all use every day. So I think,
I suppose the key thing is you retained the kind of feel and look at the usability and the flexibility of the Excel approach, but you put some discipline around it, some structure around it.
Exactly. We still have this idea that there are a lot of users that look at a paper and type in Excel without even looking at their screen, and they use the tab, enter, arrows, everything. So that is a behavior that a lot of users know and are used to working with. So we incorporated all those behaviors also in our software. So you can use it like an Excel, but it gives you way more advantages.
And I suppose you've talked a lot about data governance, because I think what we're seeing here is a much more disciplined approach, but still with flexibility, so that it's really about presenting not a straitjacket but a framework that provides that governance and that audit trail, both in terms of documents moving back and forth, different versions of the valuation, changes to some of those key data points. So it sounds like it's hopefully the best of both worlds, that flexibility, but that kind of that framework, that sort of discipline. I guess one thing that can perhaps worry people is that software can appear as a bit of a black box, and that there's a sense that calculations are taking place or things are happening that they're not able to see. And particularly in the valuation area, we need that transparency. How do you address that issue of being able to really understand everything that's taken place through a particular valuation or a series of valuations?
Yeah, so it's important to solve this big black box if you have traceable input, throughput, and understandable output. And let me explain that with some examples. So traceable input is that when I provide something in the application, I change the data, so that is my input, that I understand what will happen. And that is something that we solved with a really brand new UX design. And the UX design is something that people maybe do not know or is unfamiliar in the financial world, but it's the way you look at data and how it's presented and how you provide new data. So if you have Excel, again, back to the Excel, because it's something that everybody knows, of course, you have this spreadsheet with all the cells. And maybe you know what happens when I type something in a cell. But in software, I can add so much more functionality to a screen that you see in front of you. And if a user logs into the software and recognizes some of these components that he sees and knows if I do this, then this will happen, that helps you with knowing what your input will result in. And we use these design principles, and I think these are very important. Even if you don't use software, even if you only use a spreadsheet, if you create a financial model, it's always handy to have these design principles lying next to your screen. And some of these precise design principles is, for example, less is more. You can provide a lot of data, you can show a lot of functionality, but if it's not used or it doesn't have a purpose, then you shouldn't show it, or you shouldn't use it, or you just remove it, because nobody will ever use it. It's also accessibility. We see that it's a lot in charts, even in papers that are published, or when you see financial reports, you see these charts, and these have colors, of course, and but the essential of the reason why the chart is presented is not often understandable when you first view at it. Like if you want to show something in a chart, make sure that it's understandable for a large audience, even people who do not understand the data like you do. That also means coloring. If you do coloring and somebody who can't understand, who is colorblind, for example, and you use a lot of different colors, but it's not understandable by a person who is colorblind, then your chart is not working for them. So you can't present the data in the way you thought you would. So those are only two design principles. We have a multiple of them. So that helps you with the input. So make sure that the data that you see, that you know what happens when you provide new data. And then you go to the throughput. So I think that is the most common phrase, is that it's a calculation engine, of course, is a heavy calculation engine. It's billions upon billions of calculations happening on a really fast pace. And people say, I provide some data and there's a market value suddenly. How is that market value calculated? I think that is the most difficult question that we get every day. Mm. So we thought long and hard about this. Because we are building a brand new platform, you can think about these questions, because you can start up you can start from scratch. So we thought about a payment schedule, and a payment schedule is a very easy to explain, very hard to calculate. So a payment schedule is when you pay rent, you pay it on a certain date for a certain period for a certain amount. The same is happening with costs. So a payment schedule is just a list of payment dates, an amount, and a start and an end date for the period that you paid for. If I put all the payment schedules underneath each other, I can create a cash flow. I can also create a capitalization method. I can create a profit and loss statement. Those are all financial statements that we use in the application. But they always use that same payment schedule. And I think the most difficult one is to understand how contract conditions influence cash flows in the future. Maybe a contract is indexed, or it's a stepped contract, stepped rent contract, or a review, a renewal, a relet. There can be multiple events that increase the cash flow, or so we present them with not only a visual and of course the cash flow data, but also the payment schedules in a smart way so they can understand what happens between each payments. So if there's an index between two payments, we show them the index. So he knows, okay, if I increase the inflation by which my cash flow will increase, where do I see that in the payment schedule? So from which payment does it increase? So it helps a lot to use this payment schedule. And finally, of course, the output. So we have real life KPI insights. That means we calculate around 50 KPIs. Research shown that a human brain is only possible to handle 5 KPIs. But then again, you can configure the application in your own way. So you can only show 5 KPIs. But it is important to see if I change your market rent, or maybe change a CAPEX or OPEX, that I see which KPIs are influenced. A most common fault that I see in valuation practices is that they have let's say the management cost of a real asset is an X percentage of your market rent. And then they increase the market rent without knowing that because it's a percentage of the market rent, your management fee will also increase. And those are insights, if you have live KPI insights, which are highlighted when changing data, which are, you see, okay, my market rent goes up, and maybe my market value also goes up, but know that your management fee also goes up. So those are ways we handle those insights. And finally, of course, it's Power BI, Power BI, Power BI dashboarding. We had this conversation earlier that it's a shame that a valuation report is still this physical document that I can print. And if you see how much data is available and how we can create insights with this data, trail through a market value valuation report, see how everything influences each other, see the reasons why a evaluator choose to handle certain amounts or provided certain values. A Power BI dashboard can do that, or any other analytic tool that you use. So we use them in our software. Unfortunately, we also still have to provide that physical PDF document as an end result. But yeah, through smart visualization, you can handle this this black box feeling a lot.
And how do you see this kind of standardization, both still allowing the kind of flexibility of valuing different kinds of assets and the kind of style that valuers have, but also contributing to simply an improved valuation process? I guess there's always that tension between standardization, but allowing valuers to practice with their knowledge, and also just the hugely varied nature of the assets they're having to value, and indeed the different valuation purposes and the different, as you've talked earlier, the different kind of local custom and practice. How do you see that tension between standardization but still bringing improvements to the whole process?
Yeah, so we created a flexible engine. So the standardization is happening on a higher level. Maybe we go a step back, because in the beginning of this conversation, I told you that we are developing this new product, which is partly used for doing valuations. But if you look at the real estate market, you see that we all calculate a basis of value, and for a valuation, it's often the market value. But for other processes, like maybe creating a scenario on doing an acquisition or managing your standing portfolio, you, instead of calculating the base of value, which is the market value, you're calculating the investment value. So when we looked at this landscape, we saw that everybody uses the same source data, the same input variables, creating the same output based on the same calculation. So if you make this calculation engine standardized, really standardized, but also flexible, you eventually results in a standardized way of working, but adaptable for each basis of value. And when we achieved that, it was I think the biggest benefit of working this way is that the client, and I think that is also important, that we always talk about the evaluator creating the valuation report and determining the market value, but it's also important that the client understands the market value and see and knows how the market is viewing its asset, because it helps him understand what space he has, how can he improve the yields of the asset. So we are calculating the same value, should be the investment value or the market value, for all these processes, and they all use the same calculation engine and the same source data. So that means when a client is reviewing this valuation report, he can also do this, he can compare it with its own investment value. And that standardized way of working helps not only, let me rephrase that. That standardized way of working helps the client understand the value, so he knows what influenced this value, and what is different compared to my own investment value, which uses the same data. So yeah, I think that way of working, so that you use the same facts, so that's the source data. You use the same calculation engine, you calculate the same KPIs in the same way, helps to understand the valuation better from a client's perspective.
Indeed, and I guess that, I suppose that leads me on to a kind of final question, because this has been a fascinating chat. If you can get your, I don't know whether you use the Dutch term, a crystal ball to look in the future, but what do you see the future of valuation from this perspective of data and technology and software supporting and standardizing and providing, you know, so much additional support for the whole process?
Yeah. So to be honest, is when we of course started this new platform, it's a huge investment, and we looked at the risks. And one of the risks is, of course, a common phrase that you heard in the market, that an AVM, so that's the automated valuation model, will replace the traditional valuation methods like discounted cash flow or capitalization methods. So for us, there was also a huge risk, because our software relies on these traditional valuation models. And if an AVM would replace that, then yeah, we have, as a software provider, of course, a big problem. So we did our research, and we looked at a lot of historical research that was done about the performance of AVMs. And there we saw that that these AVMs that were created by research institutions or market parties were not performing based on the performance criteria. So that is when the mean absolute percentage error is less than 10%. And it's also depending on where you are in the world and where you are creating this AVM. So I think for valuation purposes is that when you look at an AVM relies heavily on transactional data and the quality of the transactional data. You can create an amazing tool based on machine learning, artificial intelligence, or multiple regression analysis. But if your input data, your transactional data, your observations are incorrect or you don't have enough of them, then your performance of your model will not meet the performance criteria. And in Europe, we have a different transaction database for each country. So you see that the amount of transactions that are done within a country is limited compared to, for example, America, the US, where you see a huge amount of transactions stored in the same database. And in Europe, we don't have that. Yeah, you see also that in the European market, regulations on real estate is created for each specific country. So even if you are able to compare these transactions over multiple countries within Europe, then the specific regulations for each country will influence heavily the market value of course, rented real estate. For example, you have this now mid rent caps throughout Europe, in which they want to manage the increasing prices of the residential market. And that will influence, of course, transaction prices of real estate. But if each country has different regulations, then that regulations will influence the market value differently for each country. So I think that is really difficult to handle a centralized database of transactions in Europe. And then we have, of course, this problem with regulations. We also looked into it, and then you see a statement of the TIGOVA, which is the European valuation standards, that they stated that an AVM is never more than a tool to contribute to the valuer's opinion. So that's a hard statement, I think. And it's also a statement that we follow, is that an AVM should help the evaluator instead of replace it. And maybe also interesting is that the European Banking Authority no longer recognizes the use of AVMs for bank mortgage lenders when providing mortgages. So they can no longer exclusively use AVMs. So also from a regulation point of view, an AVM is still not recognized as a purely used method to determine the market value. And we could increase maybe the performance of the model through artificial intelligence. Maybe you have this new developments like OpenAI. We all know it with ChatGPT, of course. But I think the stretch of the performance of a model is reached if you don't improve the quality of the data. Then you can still create an amazing model, but it will not solve the issue that the input data is incomplete, or there are not enough transactions. You can't influence the real estate market by a model so that there are more transactions carried out. So I think an AVM will not replace the valuator and therefore traditional valuation model. It will be more like a tool for the valuator. Maybe also an important thing is that there was a research carried out by Cushman and Wakefield, and they looked at the possibility of using an AVM in the residential market, and their conclusion was that the future will be a hybrid model, and that is a very interesting thought. Is that in a hybrid model or hybrid approach, the input variables that are used in a traditional valuation method, like a market rent or vacant possession value, or maybe some capex or opex, are based on an AVM, and but the input is still served as an input for the traditional valuation methods. So you use AVMs to determine those variables, but you still use traditional valuation methods. And I think that is the best way for, I think, the upcoming years. Maybe in the future, something in the data will change, or they can merge databases, transfer. I don't know what is possible in the future, but for now, I think this is the future, how we should look at the valuation market in case of AVMs. It also helps our clients, because our clients are often institutionalized real estate investors, and they calculate for their own purposes, of course, this investment value, which is based on a discount cash flow, and they want to influence that cash flow by doing investments and see what if I do this investment, what will happen to my income and outcome cash flows. So they still use a cash flow. And if that valuator is also creating a market value based on a cash flow, the client is able to compare its own cash flow with the cash flow of what the market should state that the asset is worth. So he can compare cash flows. If an AVM would replace this traditional valuation method, like the discounted cash flow, completely, then the client is presented with a market value, a single number, and he can't compare its own investment value and underlying cash flows anymore with the market, because he's only presented with this one number. So I hope for our clients that the AVMs will, it will take a time to incorporate them, and also, based on the available data, I don't think it's possible in the near future. But yeah, let's see what happens. It's an interesting developments that are currently occurring. So we follow those developments closely. And of course, we are a software company, so AI is used on daily basis. Maybe not in calculating a market value, but AI can be also used for writing code or testing code. So we use AI a lot in our
Indeed. Well, I think you're right. I think AVMs will have a role, but the cash flow point, I think, is very well made, that we need that consistency. We still need that underlying approach. Well, it's been fascinating to chat, Dan, and to hear your thoughts, and I look forward to catching up again. But for today, thanks ever so much for your time.
Thank you.